This is the Blueprint Podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top blue team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS senior instructor John Hubbard. And now, here's your host, John Hubbard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special season of the Blueprint Podcast, all about MITRE's 11 strategies of a world-class cybersecurity operations center. With us again, we have authors Carson Zimmerman, Ingrid Parker, and Catherine Nerler. Thank you for joining us again. In this episode, we'll be continuing where we left off in our previous episode, which was episode 0. And since we're computer people, we start counting from 0. So if you missed that one, make sure you go back and listen to that. We were covering the fundamentals in that one, so definitely some important groundwork for getting into what we're now going to be talking about in this episode. So, when we're starting this one off, we're going on a big, long journey through 12 more chapters, or 12 more episodes, 11 chapters of this book. And this is the very, very first one, right? Know what you're protecting and why. So to kick this episode off, I would love to hear, why was this the thing that you chose as the very first chapter of the book? There's got to be some significance there, right?
Yeah. So when we were first thinking about what to do with the book, so this is a second edition. Carson had written the first edition back in 2014. And we started taking a look at all the chapters and we were like, oh, do we just need to add something? Do we need to do some lightweight updates? And we realized we wanted to do a whole refactoring of the book. And we had the whiteboards out. We had all of our different ideas and we're looking at these and I'm like, we're forgetting the why. The importance of you're not doing security operations because there's a technical solution or just to do it in because you like living 2 stories underground in a basement or whatever it is. It's like the organization that you are helping to defend and protect is trying to do something. That might be that they are a nonprofit that is, helping disadvantaged communities. It might be because you are a school. It might be because you are a technology company, that is bringing new games to people. Like all of these different reasons, that's the actual why there is security operations, because there's an adversary who is trying to do something against that organization, and that organization needs to be able to do their mission. And so we started playing around with different ways to put this together. And I was very insistent that this be at the front and that we really talk about it. So it's a fairly short chapter. We tried to be pretty concise with that information. But we really thought it was important that people understand that, when you're looking at those alerts all day, those alerts aren't just pieces of data. They really translate back to what that organization is trying to do.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect opening to the book because it gets to one of the things a word I say more than anything else when I'm teaching is prioritization, right? And coming up with why are we doing what we're doing and how do we make sure we are reducing risk, to the highest level that we or reducing it to the lowest level, doing the best amount of impact, the highest amount of impact for what the resources are that we have. So this chapter is kind of all about understanding what do we have and how can we come up with what are the most important pieces of the business and what's going on in it to protect. So situational awareness, right, is kind of the theme of this chapter. Can we start by kind of giving a brief definition of what is situational awareness to you and where does that fit in with the mission of the SOC?
I'll start. Situational awareness means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And one of the reasons I'm really glad that we made this the first chapter in second edition, going along with what Ingrid said, is that I think all of us have been in too many conversations around cybersecurity generally and cybersecurity ops with people who are either uninitiated to the space or felt overwhelmed. And they're like, I don't know, not only do I not know where to begin in terms of building a SOC or making the SOC better, but like, what are we protecting and why, which is what we named the chapter. And these conversations, they tend to spin out. People they just throw up their hands. They're like, it's too complicated. I give up. And part of the reasoning in breaking the situational awareness down, which we'll define in a second, into pillars is to help people wrap their minds around a problem that goes from totally intractable and unstructured to one with at least some structure and one that is, at least defined, and we can wrap our minds around some of that. So when we defined, I'm actually going to read from the book, a definition that we adapted from a traditional definition of situational awareness. And it goes like this: within a volume of time and space, the perception of an enterprise's security posture and its threat environment, the comprehension or meaning of both taken together, meaning risk, and the projection of their status into the near future. And this definition of situational awareness applies to both what the SOC does through its daily rhythm of business, along with many other parts of the cybersecurity apparatus. And we can talk about this sense of situational awareness both tactically and macroscopically, meaning an analyst is doing this when they're triaging and investigating a specific alert or an aspect of an intrusion, all the way up to, what is our comprehension of the battle space, to pick another analogy, over the course of a year or a SOC's entire lifetime.
And this chapter is largely around the higher level stuff, right? Where we're talking about what are the users, what's the bit of data.
Right.
That's kind of the stuff that we're going to be covering here, correct?
That's right.
All right. So one of the things you call out in the beginning, just as you define situational awareness in the book, is the OODA loop, which, if people aren't familiar with it, OODA is an acronym that stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. Could you speak a little bit to how that ties in with the concept of situational awareness and where those two kind of run into each other?
So I can tackle that a little bit. And I'll step away for a minute and go to the original situational awareness, which was about pilots being able to know what's going on all around them, right? And then from there, we've adapted in cybersecurity operations to look at, okay, you got to see, what are you looking at? What's everything around you? What's the mission you're trying to do? What's your business? And then you want to orient to the actions that you're going to take. To Carson's point, you're going to look at, okay, what are the risks? What are the threats? What are all these things? And then you decide how to act. And we'll get into that in later chapters. But before you decide and go take actions, you want to make sure you have all the orientation to be able to do that effectively. You don't want to act too soon, for example, and act is the last part of that OODA loop. If you act before you have all the information and before you're oriented, you risk not eradicating whatever threats or adversaries that you're looking at. So this came from the Air Force, and we've been using it for many, many years. And yeah, I guess that's my point there.
I think there's a lot of really good parallels in the OODA loop and like where it originally came from and working in a SOC. If I can kind of go on a little micro rant of my own, not rant, but explanation of my own, and the way that I phrase this in my mind ties right in with this as well, right? In a SOC, you have to be able to observe what's happening in the environment, right? If you can't see it, there's no way you're going to stop it from happening. Your people have to be trained into interpreting that data that has been now observable and logged at some point. They have to know what to do, and that next decide, like, do I block it? Do I do something else? Who do I talk to? What do I do next? Playbooks, all that kind of stuff. And acting, the being able to actually do those things. I see people like, I know what I want to do, but I'm not allowed to do that. It takes 3 days to get the approval to do that. And in my mind, the OODA loop in ops tempo, right? It comes back to that. If your OODA loop is not going faster than the attackers, you will not be able to succeed, right? So the whole thing just ties back to, if the SOC cannot react at the same speed as the attacker can react, or faster, right? Then there's just going to be an impossibility of getting ahead of them. So I think this is a great way to kind of frame the importance of situational awareness. And it's one of the models that I love talking about as well. So hopefully that aligns with what you were already thinking about it.
It does. And I remembered my other point. So my other point was this, and it's a mini rant too. A lot of years, I worked in security operations where we were literally in dark rooms. I mean, literally. And it's really an analogy to where we were. We were in the dark. It's like, well, what are the missions and where are they? And, so the OODA loop and situational awareness, I think one of the key points of all of that is knowing what mission and business and where they are and what you need to worry about.
I'll pile on. When people first approach this space, they probably have some of the things they've seen in the movies. And right, we all have our favorite hilariously awful hacker movie. I could rattle off many, I won't. Of people, shooting cyber bullets in cyberspace in near real time. And that is so hilariously incorrect so much of the time. One of the things I recommended folks approaching the space new is that they often jump to, speed of response, and I try and back them up. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why I'm glad we have this chapter is I try to back them up to the both completeness and correctness of understanding all the things. And it's not just the adversary. There's a lot of things here that frankly are pretty mundane and tedious. It's, and I'm, not getting into it too far yet. And that is like, for instance, just understanding all the assets in your enterprise. Like, people struggle with this a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of things, stuff that's on like the CIS top, the list and all that kind of stuff where it's like very basic sounding things, right? Like know what's in your environment. We're going to talk asset inventory later on in this episode, but things like that, where it's just like eating your vegetables, right? If you don't get the basics right and you get distracted by the flashy, threat hunting or whatever, right? You can be completely failing on kind of the core of your mission while feeling like, oh, I'm doing all this advanced work and everything else is kind of truly falling apart, right? So some of this stuff, I think, in my mind, is absolutely like the foundational bricks at the bottom of building a SOC, where if they're not there, like you might feel like it's going well, and you're going to get a harsh surprise at some point in the future. So all very, very important stuff to get into. The section that kind of follows the OODA loop piece in the book is titled SOC Operating Context, right? And we broke this down into the 5 pillars of situational awareness. So to kick off the conversation around that, I'd love to hear why you picked and what you picked for these 5 pillars and why those are the 5 that are the most important.
Yeah, so if you're looking in the book, figure 5 is kind of what we're addressing right now. And there's a lot of mental models in cybersecurity, a lot of great ways that you can think about this very abstract concept and try and make it a little bit more concrete. And so we actually looked around to try and find one that matched what we were thinking and didn't see one that quite was addressing what we were trying to address. And so we went back to that whiteboard again. We put a bunch of different ideas on here, drew some different pieces, and we picked really 5 things to think about for that operating context. And so at the core of that is really that mission. And that's going to be what you're trying to prioritize. And really everything feeds into that. And then from there, we built out to say, okay, you have things like your regulations, your policies, you must do X. And especially, many of us have worked on the government side. There's a lot of those that come into play. But certainly if you're a regulated industry, that you're going to have things that you're trying to follow. And so you have to have that. You have to say, this is my auditing, these are my logs, this is how long I have to do retention. All of those things are going to come into play. We also then went into what people think about when they think more of understanding your environment, which is that data and technology. And we actually put data first because even now when I think a lot more people understand that data's, what you're looking at, people still think of it from a system perspective. They still say, oh, I'm trying to protect that server or this endpoint or this device. But we really think that data, many people have said this, that data is a really key component of that. So we want to make sure that we were emphasizing that that's all part of your technology environment. We also talked about the users. And I think as we're all seeing that transition to cloud and, software as a service and everything else, identity is becoming so huge in terms of how we're doing our protection. And so you've got that technical element of that identity piece for your users, but then you also have what are your users doing? And we're getting into this a little bit more, but, do you have a bunch of research scientists? Do you have, financial analysts? Do you have different, what are their roles? What are they trying to do? And what can you expect from them because of what they're trying to do? And then finally you have the threat piece. As I think Catherine said in our fundamental section, if you didn't have a threat, none of us would be doing this. None of us would be employed because there would be nothing to protect against. And so we really took those 5 pieces and in that diagram showed how we think they all relate and add to that operating context. And like with many things, happy if people have other opinions, would love to hear what those other opinions are about what's important. This is just a way that we were trying to show these and provide something for people to get started about and have that conversation and argue over, because that's part of the fun of cybersecurity is talking about your experiences in your context and how those fit into these models.
I'll tack one meta point onto that. If someone's approaching this area new, and I've experienced this several times, they often feel like, oh, I can't start to do security operations till I understand those 5 things. I would actually turn that around and say, one of the SOC's most important jobs is to iteratively improve all 5 of these pillars, right? That's actually one of the things that makes, working in a security operations center kind of cool, is evolving that situational awareness, not just as the enterprise and threats change, though that is true, but also just deepening their understanding of the landscape themselves. So my advice to folks is, don't feel like this is a prerequisite, rather feel like it's a journey. And I'll say this probably 10 times at least over this series. And that is don't ever feel like you're aiming to be done. You're never done. Done is you have your processes in place to constantly improve. And you can see that in every aspect of operations. This is one of them.
Yeah. And I actually wanted to highlight a point as well. I think we don't go into a lot of detail in further chapters about the compliance and legal and regulatory environments and the importance of that. But here's what I've learned. It's not a favorite topic of a lot of technical and security operations, but understanding some of those things, like what are the regulations that have to happen? If you're subject to audits and that kind of thing, you can use those to help with things like budget and resourcing and prioritization to be able to do things that maybe you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So if you can tie what you need to do in security operations technically and the tools that you need to compliance and regulatory, that's a strong thing to do.
Yeah, so that frames this discussion perfectly. There's a bunch of nuggets of kind of wisdom there that I love. First, just turning this into a mental model, right? I think, as you said, cybersecurity has a lot of mental models, but they are incredibly useful, especially for people who are new. Saying, this is a tough problem, but it kind of looks like this. There's these 5 components to it. There's these 3 things. There's these many steps in the kill chain, right? Whatever direction you want to go with it. It helps people understand and just, put a face to the problem in a way that makes it more tractable, as Carson was saying earlier. The other thing being just iteratively improving and done being, having a process in place to keep going because you're never done. I think that's a great way of doing it. And then calling out, of course, that your legal and regulatory requirements are one of the best levers you can pull to make those improvements happen and justify why you need that extra resource. With all that in mind, getting to the very first item on your list of pillars, so the business and the mission pillar. Ingrid, I know you had some thoughts about this and that you wanted to make sure were expressed here. How does understanding the SOC mission and tying that into the greater mission of the business, why is that something you think is so important for everyone to understand?
Yeah. So a lot of this comes back to how an analyst has to work. And so if you're getting a piece of information to your SOC and saying, okay, I need to take some action on this. So you're getting, an event, an alert, an external piece of information, you have to make decisions. And those decisions are sometimes really hard to make because you don't understand the context. Like if you actually don't know if your industry, your company, has, manufacturing plants in different countries, how are you going to know whether you should even be expecting, network traffic that is going between 2 different locations? If you don't understand whether you've got, different types of relationships with vendors, how are you possibly going to know what you should be expecting in terms of communications? If you've recently done an acquisition, understanding things like, for that acquisition, do they have their own SOC? Are you going to be responsible for monitoring them? How is that transition going to work? What is, we're getting into technology and users and all those pieces as we go through. But if you can understand that business, then you can start to contextualize the things that you're seeing. And without it, you're really going to be flying blind a lot of times. And I found, as I've worked in SOCs, it's sometimes hard to get people to look upwards. Like you get really excited about the data. You get really excited about finding the adversary and doing all these other things. Like that's really cool. And then you get asked to go to this all hands meeting about, whatever's changing in the company. You're like, really, you want me to sit there and listen to our executives for an hour? But it's really important to do that. It's, for the things you're trying to do, for your own career, for your teams, for everything else. And so this is really encouraging people to be curious, understand what that organization does, consider that context, then bring it in and make sure that you're going to be able to use that to be more effective what you're trying to do day to day.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of aligns with my experience as well, right? We all kind of want to dive in and get into Wireshark and look at malware and do all that fun stuff. And you're like, I got to read these like business materials and kind of understand the bigger picture. That's not fun, right? Yeah. So what I wanted to ask about that is, are there any strategies that any of you have come up with where you have been able to make that easier and more exciting and more accessible to the people working in a SOC, especially the newer people, right? Like there's so much institutional knowledge. If you're working for, like my previous company, it was an enormous pharmaceutical organization, 150,000 employees. Like keeping track of that was very, very difficult with so many things going on literally in like 150 different countries. How do we start to summarize that data, make it accessible, and then make people want to stay on top of it?
I'll offer a few points. There's a lot of different ways to approach this problem and make progress. And some of it, we talked about it at bit length later in the book. The chapter on communicate, collaborate, share is one of the big pieces. The most successful SOCs I've run into, one of the things that made them so successful was routine partnership with their constituents, their major business stakeholders. And we'll talk about that at length later. So that's one of them. A second is, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit in this episode, is a composite asset inventory and understanding, having a directory of services and business pillars and their connections to the IT assets. And the third is that knowledge base, which can take many different forms that the SOC itself will form. So if you do those things over time, you'll make progress. I would say, parenthetically, some of the most effective analysts I've run into were effective not just because they understood how to analyze data or how to herd cats in an incident, though that was true. Rather, they were effective because they spent a lot of their time trying to understand the context of what they were looking at in the business.
Yeah, context is such an incredibly important thing for every single step of working in a SOC, right? And I'm sure we're going to hit that in a whole bunch of different ways. But I love that kind of call out here directly from the start of this, is if you don't understand the greater surrounding situation, you're never going to know whether that's a true positive or a false positive or otherwise. Anything else on the kind of the business or the mission piece of it before we kind of step into the other pieces?
Yeah. So what I was going to say, this gets into motivating people. We also talk about that later in a chapter. I think it's in 4. But motivating people, some analysts like to hear from the business leaders. If you can bring them into the SOC and, let them visit and talk to the staff, that's a cool thing. That doesn't motivate all analysts, though, right? So other analysts might be motivated by other ways of learning about the mission. So, you can play little games, and we've tried a lot of different ways to try to learn the mission of what we're trying to protect, like bring in a new set of data based on mission, that kind of stuff. So, there's a lot of tidbits that you can employ to bring in mission constantly. And the other thing I would say is it's always changing. So just when you think you understand what the business is and mission, something will shift. Like suddenly they moved partnership into a cloud and you don't know about it, that kind of thing. So that's something to keep in mind. Mission isn't a one and done, just as Carson has said.
I did 2 other practical things to hear. One is identifying people in other parts of the organization that are willing to be advocates or willing to be partners with the SOC and provide that information back. And so it's not you as a SOC having to try and keep track of everything that's going on. It's having people in other parts of the company that recognize the importance of saying, hey, by the way, over in our part of the organization, this is happening. And so they're doing that synthesis. They're evaluating everything going on. And then, it's that funnel again. They're saying, oh, here's the 3 things we think you need to know. And so so leveraging others for that. And then also we mentioned this briefly here in this chapter is exercises, like doing those tabletop exercises and having people that are beyond just your SOC organization who are going to give you the real like impact of, oh, you just decided to, turn off XYZ. By the way, we use that over here for this particular manufacturing thing, or, that runs our gates in this, on this river, or this is past history of I might have recommended shutting down a port and that there was actually in use as they were trying to do transport up and down a river. So these happen. But having those people in the room then to like clarify for you is really, really important. And we're talking about tabletop exercises and other things in Strategy 11 more. But I think those are the ways you create those partnerships and you can make it real for people, is to have people from other parts of the organization engaging with your SOC in these types of activities.
Yeah, I love that. So kind of weaving in realistic parts of the business and problems and business systems into your actual scenarios, and then tying in maybe some people from those groups that can say, yep, nope, you just made a mistake and you cost us $5 million for a $10,000 problem or something like that.
The bigger, generally speaking, the bigger your SOC, the bigger your enterprise, the more this becomes something you have to deliberately spend time on and not to do by accident.
Yeah. Definitely. I was going to ask on that too. I love the advocates thing as well. That's a great tip. Just having designated people that can tell you what's coming down the pipe, right? That's part of the, shift left, right? Like don't stroll in, have someone stroll into the SOC and be like, hey, this thing's deployed. You're going to protect it, right? You want to know as early as you can, and having that person that can tell you it's coming, obviously going to be a key part of that. What I wanted to ask about that was any specific cadence or strategy of communicating with those people that you find is more successful than just kind of random hoping they tell you at the right time?
It's a blend. There's no doubt about it. It's a blend of techniques. It includes working at different levels, structured engagement, from pointing head managers to pointing haired managers. And yes, we're all managers here, by the way. So yes, I'm making fun of myself at that level. And it also includes less structured engagement between the analysts, the engineers, the operators, the responders in the SOC, and people roughly at their level elsewhere in the enterprise, critically, both for during incident response. That's where people's minds usually go, but don't just do it then. And we talk about this pretty extensively when we talk later in the book about everything from CTI and hunting and detection engineering to the chapter on communicate, collaborate, share. Think about drawing them in terms of new data sources, building hunt programs, writing detections. And as a matter of fact, this engagement is, in my opinion, the importance of it is increasing in a kind of subtle but really important way. And here's why. Back in the olden days, when all of us were doing security operations, over a decade ago, there was a stronger tendency towards slap a network sensor on it and call it good. And we can't do that as much anymore, in particular when there's no real bona fide network or even bona fide host to monitor. And what's that forcing us all to do is to ingest and reason over telemetry at the application and service layer, which forces us in turn to have that context for stuff at that layer of abstraction. And I think we're going to continue to see this trend in that direction.
Yeah. Absolutely. I agree with all that. Things have changed significantly in a short period of time, especially with everything moving to the cloud and kind of just the changing of who controls what and all that sort of stuff. So with that in mind, right, let's move on to our next kind of piece of the pillars of situational awareness here, the legal and regulatory environment piece. So the next piece of this is the legal and regulatory environment category. We kind of mentioned, obviously, why this is important, right? You don't want to be breaking the law in terms of what you collect and everything else. But where else can we go with this? And how does this drive what a SOC does day to day and what the analysts and really everyone working on the SOC needs to be thinking about as they go through their workday?
We'll be back after a quick break. If you're enjoying this episode, then you're undoubtedly interested in building the strongest security operations team that you can. For those who want to go even deeper, did you know that SANS has not one, but 2 courses that cover security operations centers as well? For the leaders, managers, and directors out there, my co-author Mark Orlando and I offer 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This course covers building your team, your physical and virtual workspace, getting the right data into your tools, and then focusing on security priorities through everyday execution of important security tasks and building the best SOC team possible. For the technical practitioners out there, my course Sec 450, Blue Team Fundamentals, Security Operations and Analysis is designed to cover everything you need to jump in being the best SOC analyst that you can be. We cover important data types, SOC tools, security logs, malware, analysis technique, automation, and much, much more. In addition, if you want to prove you can deliver the best on any security team, both courses have an accompanying certification available from GIAC. That's the GSOM for 551 and the GSOC for 450. Check out both courses and free demos available on the SANS website. You can get registered today for an in-person course at one of our many events, or go to On Demand and take either class anywhere at your own pace. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I think where I jump to when I first start thinking about this is honestly data collection and retention. That is the one that the SOC often faces when they think about these pieces. So, what can they collect? How can they collect it? Who has access to see it? How long do you have to keep it? Do you need backups? How are you doing auditing? All those types of things. So that's a very kind of tactical piece to this. I think there's also then on the other side, from an incident perspective, excuse me, what are your reporting requirements? How often, how frequently do you have to report? Who do you have to report? What has to be contained in there? And so all of those are going to come into play in different ways. And certainly, depending on your, excuse me, your industry, there's going to be different requirements for those.
Is there a way? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to tack on. That's a big trend right now. Talk to any attorney working in the cybersecurity space, and they're going to probably fill you with everything you didn't want to know about the regulatory landscape that's moving really fast right now in terms of timelines for breach notifications. So I think this is a big one. 10 to 15 years ago. I spent a lot of time worrying about data retention, and now I spend a lot of time worried about making sure that we've postured for breach notification. And again, this goes back to the lines around the business is that you have to be conscientious. Not only do those regulations exist, but they only probably pertain to certain parts of your business.
Yeah, and just to add, another up and coming for the United States is privacy. So the privacy of users, of data, and all this stuff that we're collecting and retaining are also going to have encryption requirements on how you store things. So privacy is already pretty big in Europe, and I think it's on our way to something the SOCs really have to think about as they're designing their storage and retention of data and regulation too.
So kind of a off the wall question here that isn't quite part of the book, but do you think, given all this regulation that's coming our way on who can store what and privacy regulations kind of colliding with our desire to monitor the network, do you think we're going to be going into a environment in the future where it's harder to get the data for legal reasons than it is right now? Oh,
we're already there. And I think that this is it's a tough thing, right? This whole area in terms of both, we all want privacy, right? Everyone, I've never met someone who says I don't want privacy, right? And there's a tension between that because everyone wants, especially when people go to the cloud, they also want to offload some aspect of the security mission. We can talk about this at length. In fact, cloud was one of the top topics that precipitated the second edition. And those things can feel like they're at odds sometime. And it's difficult for me to predict where we're going to be even in 10 years on this topic.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one.
It is. There's a lot of rules around, breaches when it comes to like social security numbers and personally identifiable information, that kind of stuff already. And so the SOC plays a role in that, no matter pretty much what industry you're in.
Yeah. And this has been going on for a long time. I mean, for those who are used to network traffic, we've certainly seen the transition from, network traffic can be a primary point of investigation because you can see everything unencrypted and you can see what's happening, to now we've moved on to additional data sources because a lot of that traffic is encrypted and you can't see what's happening. And I think that's going to happen more and more with the databases, the other pieces. And so we're going to have to continue to be really creative about what it is we're doing with the data that we can have access to. And as we start thinking about user and entity behavior analytics and other types of anomaly detection, I think that's going to become more and more important, because you're going to have less of the specific, I can look at one thing and I now know whether it's good or bad, and more of having to look at a set of data and put that data together in order to infer what is probably happening, which is why context and all of this is so important, because you need to know whether you're expecting that or not.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that probably leads us perfectly into our next kind of pillar you had here, which is understanding the technical environment, which is, your critical systems, your data, your inventory, and all of those things. So starting off, I guess, let's start with the inventory piece. Carson, I know you have some strong feelings on building asset inventory and kind of the difficulties and challenges around that. Where do you think, or not where, but what are the challenges that you think people are running into, and what is the most important piece of getting that part right?
This is kind of like a spectacularly mundane topic, but is utterly critical. And let me kind of describe a couple things that I think about here. One of them is, when we talk about establishing asset inventory, why is that important? And you might think, so about the things. That's true. We need having asset inventory. When I say assets, by the way, I'm not just talking about computers. I'm also talking about services and cloud endpoints and everything under the sun. And the reason why having that is so important is that it forms a denominator, and that denominator serves as a source of completeness for literally everything the SOC is doing. And most people think, patching, that's just the beginning. And then people think, about sensor coverage. And I say, yeah, that too. You also have to think about your denominator in terms of the completeness of your response, not just in vulnerability incidents, not just in the, where is log4j or SolarWinds or Java this or .NET that running, but also in terms of, where could the adversary be and have we eradicated them? To, our detection coverage in the moment, to, you name it. So with that understanding out of the way, one of the experiences that I've had is you'll come to the table with a lot of impassioned, very smart people, and they'll have data. And the person from Active Directory will say, I am the single source of truth of all the computers on the network. And then you go to the person with the vulnerability scanner and they say, I am the single source of truth of everything on the network. And then you'll go to the person in IT asset management and say, I am the single source of truth of everything on the network. And you can imagine this going on for a while. And by the way, there's no border around the network anymore, because it's 2023. And so the answer is they're all simultaneously right and wrong. And what the enterprise has to do is draw all these sources of signal, all these sources of inventory, into a system, a composite inventory, where they reason over that in terms of their different priority, their different start and stop signals, and taking into account things like ephemeral, meaning non-persistent assets like, containers and, laptops that come on and on offline and all that fun stuff. And then you're probably thinking, what in the world does this have to do with the SOC? Well, guess what? The SOC is in the data business, and oftentimes they know about the sources of this signal better than anyone else does. So one of the things that I see highly effective SOCs doing is translating their knowledge of that signal to the people who own this composite inventory, and B, leveraging that composite inventory in literally everything they do. Why is that important? It's not just a matter of incident response or detection coverage or sensor coverage or anything like that. That forms the basis of their shared situational awareness with literally every stakeholder they interact with at a technical level, the rest of the cybersecurity apparatus, and for that matter, any other major stakeholders in IT, OT, cloud, pick your favorite buzzword. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
And we're done with this episode. No, just kidding. Yeah, absolutely. Right. A very, very crucial topic to be really on top of and understand how it touches everything that you're going to be doing in terms of prioritizing alerts to incident response and everything in between. When you're coming up with this list of assets, obviously you got to pick out what are the most critical systems and connect them to the bigger kind of business systems that they feed and what's going on there. How does one approach that kind of a problem to understand, like, okay, these are all of our servers, but these are the really, really important ones, and then store that information so the SOC can use it?
I'll mention one comment and then I'll yield to my esteemed co-authors. People often get wrapped around the axle about assigning criticality and risk on a per server basis. And yeah, sure, you can do that. And I encourage it. But what is equally perhaps more meaningful is backing up and zooming out and assigning business function to that, because then you can have a much richer conversation about what's what and what's why and why is why, right? So being able to associate assets, and for that matter, users and other digital stuff like your data estate to business functions allows people to have much more meaningful and nuanced conversation about every aspect of, from what detections are we writing to what do we monitor first.
Any other kind of thoughts on?
So another thing that I've done in the past is kind of collect where I think the important information is. And it's usually based on a conversation that's offhand. Like, oh my gosh, can you believe all the intellectual property for this one little thing is sitting over here? It's like, okay, let me note that so that I know where that asset is and what it's doing, to Carson's point, what kind of business or mission it's doing, right? So that's super important, is prioritizing. So in my mind, if I see something come across that's data or traffic to a particular resource that's important to me, I'll zero in on that. That doesn't always work, but that's just kind of a rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think there's a situation where you can start from some tactical things. So you could start by saying, hey, what do I actually have, in my Active Directory? What do I know from DHCP? What do I know from, my device management systems, those types of things. And ideally, that is something that's going to be a little bit more live, a little bit easier to automate, have some updates to it, those types of things. And then you build knowledge on top of that to say, oh, we've learned about X and it relates to this. And so you try and tie those together. And Carson hit on this, and it's at the end of our the strategy as well, and don't try and do it all at once. Find something that you can get repeatedly. You can partner with that organization. They will send you that data, and then build on top of it and do that over time. Do not from day one of building a SOC think you have to have all of this in place right to begin with.
I'll mention one more thing to solidify Ingrid's point. Some of the best cybersecurity apparatuses I've run into, some of the best SOCs, right, and all their cybersecurity stakeholders, spend roughly as many dev and engineering resources on their composite asset inventory as they do their SIEM. And every people I talked to about this, they looked at me completely stunned, because SIEM and all this data analytics stuff, it gets all the fanfare, all the ML and AI, and pick your favorite buzzword. And because the problem of reconciling both moving asset data and a confluence of different asset signal is business specific and complex, is why, in my opinion, it necessitates, a substantial amount of resourcing.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, and I don't have any data to support this, but it feels like it's an exponential problem, right? Like you got 100 computers, that's one level of difficulty, but then you get to 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Like the different combinations of interactions between those things is just I forget what they call that, but it grows in a geometric kind of a way, right, where everything can talk to everything else, and the problem and the potential interactions there just become very, very difficult to track. And I think that leads us into our next kind of pillar here. Understand users, user behaviors, and service interactions, right? So we just kind of talked about like what are the systems that are important, but it's not just the system, because the question isn't just, is the system hacked or is it not? It's who are the people that can log into that systems? What are the other services that can log into that systems, or the functional accounts, or whatever you want to call them, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways that something might be threatened on a user or as a behavior of someone using that system in a way that is bad, even though they're technically allowed to use it, maybe an insider threat scenario. How do we get a hold of and even start to understand, like, all right, these are the people that should be doing these things on those services and servers?
So let me jump in, because I have a bridging topic that may get tomatoes thrown at me. I'm not sure here. I'm going to bring up zero trust architectures. So I'll just duck there. So the reason I bring this up is because there are some organizations out there that have decided they're going to move toward this wonderful buzzword of zero trust. And really, when they're doing that, they're not including the security operations, which is a key component of doing zero trust architectures and all of that other stuff. But what I've seen so far is that the SOC hasn't been included in those very primary early discussions on doing zero trust, especially in large environments. And the reason I bring this up is part of the technical environment, and understanding that is understanding where is your organization going next, with or without you, right? So a lot of times SOCs aren't necessarily seeing what the plans are for IT moving forward. So having those connections becomes more important for future things and things that are being rolled out as we speak moving forward. So yeah, zero trust, which is a combination. You had asked about users and all of that. So it's a combination of understanding the identity, your users, and the machines they're using, or the VMs or whatever, and also the data. So it brings those three things together. So understanding what your users are and where they are and how they're being identified, on the front end of things is important. I'll yield the floor after the zero trust comment.
Catherine, I agree. I'll offer another bridging topic. One of the things that SOCs can potentially fall into a trap. Let me explain. A proportion of the detections that the SOC will perform, particularly in enterprises where there's a large number of not just users, but privileged users doing highly privileged things, will amount to rules and detections that look for users acting in ways that stray from accepted behavior. In cases where a hard rule would be inappropriate. And the trap that they can fall into is becoming a spam cannon of, was that you? Did you mean to do that? Was that you? Was that you? Was that you? And they'll emanate far more signal around those user confirmation activities than they do, and or feel like they need to touch them. It can be a huge resource drain. So my point in all of this, not skipping too far ahead, is one of the ways to make progress in this area is creating those detection, those hunts around expected and unexpected behaviors. But we also want to be guarded in how we're landing that and how we interact with our constituents.
Yeah, building on that, like a common thing I'm seeing now is unexpected travel. So user logs in from one location, user logs in, from another location at the same time, or maybe it's, hey, we haven't seen them log in from this location in X number of days. We saw this a lot over the holidays recently, where we were getting a lot of alerts coming through of, hey, this person normally logs in from Bulgaria and now they're logging in from California. Is that something you expect? And it's like, and so SOCs are spending a lot of time trying to track that sort of thing down. And so having a way to not only have that come in when it is unusual, but then have a way to track to correlate that with what a user does. So sometimes you won't be able to track this down, like especially during the holidays. But if you know that somebody is a salesperson and that they are likely to be going around the globe, that's going to be very different than maybe your finance person who you would expect to be working from one location. Or this goes back to understanding your context. So are you an organization where everybody comes into the office and they should be coming out of that office environment all the time? Or is it a hybrid environment, a remote environment where you would see the coffee shops and you would see all of these other locations and those types of things? And so I think trying to add all of that in, but recognizing that as we start moving into users and we start moving into more data, having to do these analytics on the data that isn't quite as understood, the false positive rate, and we're getting into false positives later, these are things that you get alerts on, but aren't things that you need to actually turn into incidents. That rate is going to be higher. And so how do you automate some of that away? And I've heard there are, I've not worked with this, but like organizations where they will send automatic messages to users using a different technology, to say, hey, was this you? And as long, so they might send it over their phone or something else. And the user can just say, yes, it was me. And so you're taking that away from being something the SOC has to look at to being something where the user can have that interaction and kind of automate it away. So those types of techniques, I think, are going to be really important as our SOCs move forward.
Yeah. And
I don't get overwhelmed.
Yeah. And I think the holy grail that all SOCs would love to have is what's normal, right? We've been asking that for 30 years or more, at least my whole career. What's normal? And you never get there because there's so much change happening all the time. There's people like someone adds a new phone number. Is that bad? Well, we know some major incidents where that was bad. So how do you know, when something's normal or not normal? But that is kind of something to always aspire to, is learning what is normal for an environment. And the best analysts spend a long time understanding, okay, that's a normal service over this ephemeral port. We already know it. They track some of that stuff to kind of tamp down the false positives and the asking the questions, to Carson's point about the bandwidth. Is this you? Is this you? So it's a challenge, definitely.
Yeah. So with that, what I was thinking is there's kind of two pieces to that. There is the context building of these people are in these groups, they're salespeople, they travel, and making sure when there's an alert that goes off for those users that there's something that tells that to the analyst, right? And automatically presents that information to them so that they have that context. The other thing I think is just, this is kind of a totally outside of this conversation thus far that we've had, but keeping people on the team for a long time and not having a constant staff turnover will just inherently allow people to build up that institutional knowledge. And the longer they're there, the more like, oh, that's that one part of the network. And they always have that happen. That's that one person. They always upload large files, right? Just a retention piece, I think, is a big part of getting that right. And just keeping people on the team. And the more they know, the better they're going to be really well-tuned anomaly detectors, right? Like true anomaly detectors. So that's something we can talk about when we get to the building the team conversation and all that sort of stuff later on. That covers the user and the user behavior piece. Any thoughts on the service interaction piece of this pillar? How do we track that or get any have any tricks for that?
I would say it, at least to a degree, is a lot of the same. And for what it's worth, that's why we put those service to service interactions in this portion of situational awareness, is that the way we reason over and store and kind of build up that corpus of knowledge looks and feels similar with some distinctions. Service to service interactions have always been kind of, and perhaps more explicitly, service to service trust is what keeps a lot of people, myself included, up at night. And a big piece of that is understanding this is now we've moved from understanding what specific users or groups are doing, but to understanding the service architecture. And, if you have the benefit of having a mature SDLC apparatus where service owners are compelled to write down their threat models or other informations about their services in a place you can get to, that is a huge opportunity here. However, I acknowledge most people don't have that luxury. So, and then it becomes a story of like beg, borrow, steal, like go and talk to your friends.
Yeah, with the nature of attacks we're seeing now, where people are going after identity systems and, golden SAML attacks and all this crazy stuff going on, like, it's something you absolutely need to consider. This thing lets you into that thing, and how everything, authentication works across all of these systems that we probably weren't using 5 to 10 years ago. It's still relatively new stuff, and people might not be as good at kind of understanding that and securing it and locking it down. So a whole bunch of stuff to kind of think of there in that category. The final pillar that you had here is understanding the threat. We're going to talk in depth more about CTI, but as it pertains to this particular chapter, what do you think are the most salient points of situational awareness as it comes to understanding the threats that are out there?
I guess I'll go. I think that the most important thing to know is that you have threats, right? And there's some organizations, the security operations folks usually know there's threats, and they usually know what they are to some extent. The leadership also needs to be aware of what the threats are. I think that's an important point of this chapter, is making sure you have this interaction and hopefully ongoing dialogue with your stakeholders in your leadership to understand, no, we really do have some leadership. We really do have some threats that the leadership needs to be aware of, and some real adversaries, and to characterize some of the incidents that you've had over time. Studying some of the incidents you've had can help you understand, okay, this is what we've been up against in the past. It may not necessarily be what's in the future, but at least you have kind of a trend to look at moving forward.
So building from what Catherine was saying, I've seen with some SOCs, they focus on external threat intelligence first, and they think, oh, that's where we have to go. We have to get a feed in. We have to do, get this data from others. And I really want to emphasize the point she was bringing up of look to your own organization to start with. Especially your organization will have likely had incidents. They have things that you can learn from. That's going to give you a feel for what types of threats are out there, what kind of categories you're interested in. Are you seeing a lot of commodity malware? Do you have, more advanced actors that are in your environment? Build from that, and then you can start adding in, other pieces. And so, CTI, I think for some SOC analysts is still, cyber threat intelligence is still kind of a like, oh, that's something different. That's a mystery. That's other pieces. But we're starting to see more of that come together, whether that function is actually within the SOC or somewhere else. I think there's starting to be a lot more understanding of the types of information that you need to get from threat intelligence to actually be actionable in the SOC. And that's something to think about as well, is that cyber threat intelligence sometimes is seen as this very high level country to country type of discussion. And really, you can get down to more operational, more tactical discussions, things where you can actually look at the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and provide that information in a way that the SOC can truly do something with it. And so we're jumping into all of that with Strategy 6, which is a cyber threat intelligence strategy. But it's definitely, as we keep saying, if you didn't have the adversary, we wouldn't be doing this.
Yep. And I love the way you broke it down kind of in this section too, and just like the very basic pieces of like, what about the constituency might be of interest to an adversary, right? Think about, if you were an attacker, what would you steal from your organization, and start there, right? Go read some reports in the news. Go think about what has actually happened to people like you or actually your org in the past. It doesn't have to be this incredibly complex, academic exercise. It can be a very practical, like, hey, we've seen this attack before. We need to make sure that same thing doesn't happen again, because clearly it's a realistic threat that we might face. So I love taking that kind of approach.
I'll add a couple of things there, which, we'll return to in a couple of the later chapters. One of them is when we think about the threat and the scope of the threats we need to comprehend, it's worth mentioning that we should be constantly thinking about insider threat and actors who have compromised our own legitimate user accounts. And we also think about fraud and abuse. And I don't just mean fraud perpetrated by internal employees, particularly if the enterprise offers any kind of service to anyone else, right? And anything that looks or smells like a cloud service or anything as a service. That is a place where SOCs may be running towards very rapidly because they weren't previously recognized as an area of investment and may suddenly become a major problem for the business.
Yeah, it's definitely a changing game, but it's something that's super intimidating for a lot of people. That kind of gets to our kind of final piece here, which is the last section of this chapter, which is building awareness over time. You had already mentioned a couple of times, it's like, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Do what you can with what you have at the, situation that you're presented with at any given time in the SOC. Obviously, we are looking to build up as much knowledge as we can in as short of a time as possible. Any kind of closing thoughts on how and what we should prioritize if you were building a SOC from like zero?
I can offer one example. It's about building momentum and about building rhythm. One of the best ways that I can see a SOC that feels overwhelmed make progress in this area is expend a measured amount of resources on getting good at a service or set of services or set of users that the SOC has reason to be concerned about. And that concern might be based on past incidents, CTI, hunts, wild speculation, hopefully not wild speculation. And the reason why I make that remark is it reinforces a bunch of stuff. It reinforces for the analysts that they can do it. And it reinforces for their partners, their constituents, that they can do it. And it shows the kind of material outcomes and hopefully dollar or euro or whatever your local currency is figures that then says, oh, we're spending this money on the SOC with an outcome, and it doesn't just look like a money sink.
Yeah, I love that. Getting those like established wins, giving people that confidence as they start to build up, I think is really, really important as well. Any other thoughts on the kind of building awareness over time that we haven't covered so far? Or anything from this chapter?
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize the automate where you can. Create those connections to things where you are not having to manually go in and update a spreadsheet. So if you can connect into another system, somebody else is doing that updates, it's your Active Directory, it's whatever's out there, that's going to give you longevity without you having to go in and expend manual energy every single time it happens. And then you can get into the more, boutique, hey, we want to learn about this and put some context on top of it and customize for certain areas. But anytime you can create a connection that you don't have to go in and manually update, that's going to be so much easier to work with.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. And prioritize what your assets are that you're looking at. You can't look at everything. So really back to that composite inventory, super important to have that, and super important to choose where are your business jewels kept in your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that might be perfect place to end it, right? Know what you have, protecting, what you know, or knowing what you're protecting and why, right? Ultimately bring it right back around to the title of the chapter there. So anything to close up here? Any final thoughts on, as a result of what's in this chapter, what people should say, like, hey, do I have this? Do I have that? Any kind of takeaways before we wrap it up?
Iterative improvement. It's the name of the game for everything the SOC does.
Yeah. Perfect. Love it. All right. Thanks again so much, everyone, for joining me. Really appreciate it. For the listeners, again, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast on your favorite podcast aggregator. Blueprint is everywhere. And we are now on YouTube on the SANS Cyber Defense channel. We will have the links to both of those in the show notes as well, if you're interested in looking for, or the description for the video if you're on YouTube. So in our next episode, what we're going to be covering is Chapter 2, which is another exciting one. Give the SOC the authority to do its job, right? Another crucial one. Any SOC that isn't empowered to do what it needs to do is not going to be effective. So this is one you're not going to want to miss. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Blueprint.